Mark chapter 15. We're not going to spend a lot of time rehearsing. I think most people, whether you've been in church for any length of time or not, are at least somewhat familiar with the crucifixion process. You can go back and reread where we've been the last few weeks as this has unfolded. But when we last left Jesus, as the sun rises over Jerusalem, the morning after Passover, daybreak fails to reveal the terrible injustices that occurred the night before. An innocent man was unfairly betrayed, arrested, forsaken, tried, beaten, and then condemned to die. And no one was there to stop this travesty of injustice. This happened to Jesus alone. The religious leaders have one agenda. They've had one agenda since the beginning of Mark's gospel, since early in Jesus' ministry. Their one agenda is to get rid of Jesus at all costs. And they will not stop until their malicious plan is finalized. So from their illicit, illegal trial the night before, they accused Jesus of blasphemy, claiming to be equal with God, which he did. And if he is not equal with God, then he is blasphemous. In Jewish law, such a claim is worthy of death. But there is one problem. These Jewish leaders do not have the jurisdiction to enforce a capital punishment sentence. They are living under Roman rule. And religious disputes are inadmissible in a Roman court of law. They need state sanction to execute Jesus. And so they must twist their accusations into a political violation in order to persuade the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, who happens to be in Jerusalem to maintain peace during Passover. It was not his normal place of residence, but he always came to the city during the time of Passover because, again, hundreds of thousands of Jews gathered from out the known world, and the Jewish-Roman tension was high. And so Pilate would be there to enforce the domineering hand of Rome if necessary. And so there he is, and they must persuade Pilate, Pontius Pilate, that Jesus is deserving of death. And that's where we pick up in our text in chapter 15, verse 1. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. This would be the Sanhedrin, which is kind of the Jewish Supreme Court. They bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. If we draw upon some of the other gospel writers, Luke in this case, Luke informs us that Jesus is brought before Pilate on basically three charges. One, perverting the nation, so creating a riot in essence. Two, forbidding taxes, which is a big deal in the Roman Empire. And three, claiming to be a king or the Messiah, this political king. These are the three charges they bring against Jesus to Pilate. They want Pilate to see Jesus as a potential threat to the Roman Empire. And so they bring these charges of treason against Jesus to Pilate. Now we know, reading the story of Jesus, the exact opposite is true in all these charges. Jesus worked for the betterment of society. On the forbidding taxes issue, Jesus said, "Render to Caesar, give to Caesar what is due Caesar. Give him what belongs to him." He is the opposite of a political revolutionary. He brought healing and restoration and peace. Now, the irony of these charges they have brought against Jesus, the irony is they accuse Jesus of being exactly what they want. They want a Messiah who will come in and overthrow the Romans. They want a Messiah who will come in and set up a political kingdom. They want a Messiah who will come in and establish an earthly dynasty and overthrow their captors. So they are accusing Jesus of being exactly what they want him to be. But he was not that. He was the opposite of that. But they used this charge to persuade Pilate that Jesus is a threat. And so you can see where Pilate goes. His first, and there's more conversation that happens between Jesus and Pilate that Mark does not include. But you see where Mark takes it. You are the king of the Jews, Pilate asks. In the original language, this is as much of a statement as a question. You are the king of the Jews. This is multiple times now we've seen as Mark writes his story of the trial and arrest of Jesus, that Mark puts words of truth in the mouth of the accusers of Jesus. The accusers of Jesus said, you're going to rebuild the temple. That was true. The chief priest accused Jesus of being the Messiah, the Son of God. That was truth. Pilate says, you are the king of the Jews. That's truth. Over and over again, Mark puts words of truth in the mouths of the accusers. Now, here's how Jesus basically responds in the original. You say so, Jesus responds. He neither affirms the statement, which would have been grounds for execution, nor does he deny the statement. What Jesus in essence is saying is, Pilate, you would do well to consider that very question. Who am I? And I might stop and say to all of us, we would do well to consider that question as well. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Is he who he claimed to be? Well, the religious leaders, they hurl more accusations against Jesus, and Pilate pushes. Do you hear what your accusers are saying about you? Jesus remains silent. He will not defend himself against these bogus accusations and these trumped-up charges that they have brought. Pilate is amazed, the text says, by his silence and his refusal to defend himself. It's amazing to all of us. I mean, think about our own context. If we are falsely accused of anything that we know that we are not guilty of or innocent, or there's another side of the story, what are we quick to do? Defend ourselves. Get the words out there. Get the truth out there. Get our perspective out there. We are quick to defend ourselves. I mentioned last week the work of Brian Stevenson and his organization, the Equal Justice Initiative, that as part of their initiative seeks out and exonerates prisoners who are on death row who are falsely accused. And I was thinking about that, and I thought, is there any more of a helpless feeling than for someone to be convicted and sentenced to death over a crime that they know they did not commit? Can you imagine that feeling? That if you were sitting on death row, sentenced to die over a crime that you knew, it may be only you knew, that you did not commit. We would be very vocal, we'd be very loud, right, to try to defend our innocence. Here Jesus stays quiet. He remains silent, refusing to defend himself to the point that Pilate is amazed. Verse 6, now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews? And they cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? Again, truth words in the mouth of Pilate. But they shouted all the more, crucify him. So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas. And having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. From the other gospel accounts, we know that Pilate believes that Jesus is innocent and undeserving of death. Even this pagan ruler perceives the ulterior motive of the religious leaders. This text says that they were envious. This word envy means to be angry over another person's success. That Jesus had drawn the crowds in, the people loved Jesus, and the religious leaders are angry. They are envious. So Pilate considers maybe there's a third way, a possible way out, and not only a possible way out, but a way for Pilate to gain favor, to win favor with the crowds in the process. This was important for a Roman ruler. So Pilate kind of sees this alternative route. Maybe I can win the crowd over in the process of doing a good thing. The text says that during Passover, it is customary to release one prisoner at the request of the people. So Pilate presents what he feels like are two obvious choices on who would receive amnesty. He says, will I give you Jesus or Barabbas? Barabbas is an insurrectionist. He's a rebel. He's a revolutionary. He's a murderer. The other text says that he is a thief. Now, let's stop for a moment here and say, if Barabbas is an insurrectionist, and if he is a revolutionary, and this text even seems to refer to a particular incident that they are talking about that would have been known to the readers of Mark's gospel, that there maybe was this one particular rebellion that Barabbas was a leader in, a part of. In some ways, Barabbas might have been considered a little bit of a local hero to those people, that he was one that led a charge to overthrow the Romans. In Pilate's mind, he's a murderer, an insurrectionist, a thief. Like, why would they want Barabbas? But there might have been a story behind the story of what was going on with Barabbas. But either way, in Pilate's mind, it's an obvious choice here. The choice for amnesty seems obvious. Jesus, this peasant, self-proclaimed king of the Jews, leading this ragtag group of followers, or Barabbas, the murderous, thieving revolutionary. But we know what's been going on. The religious leaders have been working the crowd. They leverage their influence and authority to stir the mob to demand the execution of Jesus. Now, there's a lot of speculation about who this crowd is. Who is this crowd that's there to demand the crucifixion of Jesus? So is this a group of religious proponents who are, the advocates for the religious leaders? Are they paid off in some way by the religious leaders? Are they simply intimidated? They do not want to be the ones siding with Jesus over the religious leaders. Is this the same group who just days before shouted the accolades of Jesus when he entered into Jerusalem? At a minimum, there seems to have at least been some in this crowd who have been touched by the ministry of Jesus. But now they demand his execution. And this is tragic. That some in this crowd, no doubt, have experienced, maybe had family members, friends, who have been touched somehow by the ministry of Jesus. And yet, under the persuasion and the power and the influence of others, they have turned against Jesus. Crucify him. Crucify him. You see a very common portrayal here of kind of mob mentality, crowd control, going along with the group for my own protection. Give us Barabbas. Give us Barabbas. Well, what shall I do with Jesus? Pilate questions the crowd. Crucify him, the frenzied horde demands. 3 times Pilate lobbies for Jesus. What evil has he done? Pilate retorts. Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. The mob insists. And at the end of the day, for Pilate, this traveling rabbi is not worth the risk of mob violence. Pilate does not want to start a riot. If you read the history of Pontius Pilate, you'll know that on multiple occasions he caused riots. He caused Jewish revolts. He had to calm or bring in the big forces to squelch at different times. And Pilate does not want that to happen. So he acquiesces to the crowd, and in one final attempt to appease this bloodthirsty crowd, he turns Jesus over to be, the text says, scourged. Now, this phrase is just used kind of in passing in Mark's gospel. If you've heard the crucifixion of Jesus talked about before, you know that this idea of scourging is a Latin word that means literally to remove the skin. And so they would take a victim and strip them from the head down, their back, their buttocks, their legs. And Roman soldiers who were trained assassins would use what's often called a cat of nine tails, which would be a rod with 9 pieces of leather with some type of bone or stone or sharp object attached to the end of those 9 pieces of leather. And that the Roman soldiers, who again used this type of torture repeatedly and were very equipped at doing this, would literally make it their goal to strip the skin from the victim, as they would cruelly and harshly just tear the skin from the victim's back. If you read Roman history, a lot of people that were scourged before they were crucified did not even survive the scourging. It was a very barbaric and savage and often fatal act of violence against the victim. And so Pilate sends Jesus to be scourged, to have the skin stripped from his body, again, in an attempt to appease this angry crowd. But the crowd is not satisfied, and they continue to demand the crucifixion of Jesus. Now, let me say a word about Pilate here. Pilate sacrifices an innocent target for political security, to protect himself, to cover himself. He begins by seeking amnesty for Jesus, and he ends the episode by seeking amnesty for himself. He allows popular opinion to control his decision making. And Jesus is handed over to these soldiers to be tortured and then crucified. Verse 16, we read about the incident. The soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. A Roman battalion at that time was up to 600 soldiers. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and they began to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews! And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. Jesus in this episode is the innocent victim of the soldiers' depravity. If Jesus is the King of the Jews, they're going to treat him accordingly. It would be laughable in the mind of these Roman soldiers for there to be a Jew that would be considered a king who would overthrow the Romans. And so you kind of see how that plays out here. They're making fun, not just of Jesus, but the very idea that there would be some type of Jewish king. And so you see how it plays itself out as they make a mockery of Jesus. Here is your king, they say, as they take a crown of thorns and pierce the brow of Jesus. Here is your king, as they beat him with a rod or a reed. Here is your king, as they place this purple robe on the severely beaten back of Jesus. Here is your king, as they pay homage to Jesus. This sign, Hail, King of the Jews, would have been similar to Hail, Caesar in that day, how they would pay homage to him. And so you can see the mocking that takes place here. You can see that they spit on him. Is there anything more vile and gross and demeaning than to be spit upon by someone else? And so you can see what they're doing here. The soldiers, this is important, listen to this. The soldiers have their way with Jesus, so sin cannot have its way with us. The soldiers have their way with Jesus, so that sin cannot have its way with us. And when the soldiers grow tired of torturing Jesus, they lead him away to be nailed to a cross. What a horrific picture of what Jesus endured for our sin. The innocent treated as the guilty so that the guilty can be declared innocent. Now, Mark's account, unlike a few of the other gospel writers, Mark's account is very concise. He's very restrained in his details. He simply says Jesus was scourged. He doesn't go into the graphic details like I've provided today. Mark does not attempt to exploit the savagery of the event to sensationalize the death of Jesus. He's not seeking to evoke empathy from his readers. As a matter of fact, Mark focuses primarily on the shame of Jesus, on the mockery to which Jesus is subjected. Mark's first century readers, as we mentioned multiple times throughout this series, Mark's first century readers are also facing severe and savage persecution. The madman Nero, the tyrant Nero, is now in charge. Nero is willing to set his own kingdom afire to prove a point and blame it on Christians who then are savagely beaten and thrown to wild animals and face the gladiators. Mark's first century audience facing severe and savage persecution under the cruel and vicious ruler Nero. And so Mark highlights the inner turmoil of Jesus as he did in the garden. Mark points to the faithfulness of Christ in the face of suffering. Mark points to what's going on inside of Jesus as he goes through the shame and the mockery, because he knows that's what his readers are facing. So Mark's not making an attempt to try to highlight the savage beating that Jesus went through or the cruelty of the cross, even though all those things are very true. But what Mark wants us to understand is that we follow a Christ who is faithful in the face of suffering. That your suffering will look different than what Jesus endured. That your suffering might not be the same as what Jesus faced or Mark's first century readers faced, but that there is a Savior who was faithful all the way to the cross in what he endured so that we might have life. So let me just point out a few highlights, a few reminders from this very vivid text. We're reminded in this text that Jesus is innocent. Jesus is innocent. He is innocent. There is a significant shift in the last couple of chapters in Mark from Jesus as this active agent who is healing and he's teaching and he's touching the lepers and he's engaging people, right? And he's talking to the crowd and he's teaching his disciples. He's a very active person in most of Mark's gospel. And then there's a shift that takes place and Jesus becomes this very passive victim. He is on the receiving end of everything. Do you know when the shift takes place? The shift takes place when Jesus is in the garden on his face before the Father, praying, "Not my will, but your will be done." From that point forward, Jesus is not the one acting. Jesus is the one being acted upon. A shift, a surrender of his will to the Father, faithful obedience. The four Gospels let us know together that Jesus went through 6 different trials. Did you know in these 6 trials, Jesus was never found guilty of a single crime? He was never found guilty of a single sin. 5 times Pilate declared his innocent. Herod, who is a madman, the other gospel writers tell us that Pilate, again, in kind of this last-ditch effort, sends Jesus over to this guy named Herod. Now, read Herod's history. It's even more gruesome than Pilate's. Herod does the same. He makes a mockery of Jesus, but then sends him back saying, Jesus is innocent. I can find no guilt on this guy. Over and over and over again in the text, the innocence of Jesus is declared. Mark kind of tips his hand in this text as he portrays Jesus as the innocent, spotless, silent lamb of Isaiah chapter 53. That he never sinned, but he became sin. That he never committed a crime, but he died as a criminal. That the innocent dies on behalf of the guilty. So here's the gospel for us. Jesus did what we are incapable of doing. He lives a sinless life. He models what we are incapable of doing. He remains faithful and true in the most difficult of trials. And because of his innocence, I have been declared innocent to the Father. Jesus is innocent. But there's also a very clear truth in this text as well, and that is this, that we are sinful. We're sinners. Every party involved in this travesty reminds us of the depth of human depravity. The religious leaders, Judas, the angry mob, Pilate, Barabbas, the disciples, the false accusers, the false witnesses, layers upon layers upon layers of evil and depravity. Each character in the story, both the named and the unnamed, speak to the depth of our sin. God sent his sinless Son to earth, where he did miracles, he healed the sick, he raised the dead, he opened blinded eyes, he opened deaf ears, he displayed unconditional love and compassion, and we beat him and mocked him and crucified him. And I say we because we stood among the crowd that day. Our sin cried for his execution. Our sin demanded his crucifixion. Our sin nailed him to a cross. If you've seen the movie The Passion that was written and directed by Mel Gibson, it's a riveting movie. But one thing that kind of captured my attention in the story of the movie is in the scene where they pierce the hand of Jesus with a nail the nail into the hand of Jesus. And there's a scene where you just see the hand of the soldier driving the spike into the hand of Jesus. That when they were shooting that scene, that Mel Gibson demanded that he be the one that held the hammer to drive the nail. So in the movie scene, when you see the nail being driven, it's the hand of Mel Gibson holding the hammer that drives the nail. And he did that because he said he wanted the visual reminder that it was his sin that nailed Jesus to the cross. That it's our sin that demanded his execution. It is our depravity that put him on the cross. And again, Mark is continually going back to Isaiah 53 with these images and these allusions. And Isaiah 53 reminds us that we all are like sheep who have gone astray, that we have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all, that we are the sinners responsible for the death of Jesus. We can't think that we would not be in the crowd that day. We can't think that if I was there, I would be different. We can't think that I would not have been a participant, because we were all participants. Our sin makes us participants. We are sinners. And then the last and beautiful truth that comes out of this text is this. On the cross, Jesus became our substitute. That he is our substitute. Pilate presented the crowd with a choice that day. Jesus or Barabbas. And the people chose Barabbas. And so literally on that day, Jesus took his place. A convicted murderer is set free, and the innocent Son of God is condemned to death. Picture this. From the story of Jesus and the crucifixion of Jesus, we know it was common practice that in order to make a statement, that the Romans, when they crucified someone, and they crucified hundreds of thousands of victims during this time frame. When they crucified someone, they would put their name and their crime on a placard over the head of that crucified victim to make a statement to the rest of the empire and to any passerby. Like if you get on the wrong side of the Roman Empire, this is how it ends for you. And they would make a public display of the victim and their crime by announcing it, right? Putting it on the sign. If you know the crucifixion story of Jesus, you know this happened. That they put over the head of Jesus, the King of the Jews. Like they would put the crime over the head of the one who was being crucified. So when you think in those terms, and reality is, Barabbas had a sign that was to be hung over his head when he was crucified. Barabbas, insurrectionist, murderer, thief. There was a sign that had been made or was going to be made to hang over the head of Barabbas. And instead of a sign with the name Barabbas, Pilate creates a different sign with the name Jesus. Barabbas had a sign with his name on it until the name Jesus is substituted for the name Barabbas. Every single Barabbas who would ever live. Every act of betrayal, violence, and suffering that Jesus faced that day was for every Barabbas who would ever live. It was for you, and it was for me. Jesus was forsaken and betrayed and beaten and mistreated and abused and killed so that I would not be forsaken, betrayed, mistreated, abused, harmed, or killed by him. We read it in Peter's letter this morning. By his stripes, we are healed. His death is my means of escape. Now, does that mean that as you're living in this broken world that you are not going to be forsaken, betrayed, beaten, mistreated, abused by other broken people, other sinful people? No, we can flash back to the second point here. We are all sinners, and so we face those things in the broken world that we live in. But the reality of the gospel is Jesus went through all of those things so that he might endure those things on your behalf, so that he might be the one who is faithful, who is loving, who is kind, who is compassionate, who will not forsake you, who will not abuse you, who will not harm you, who will not hurt you. He is faithful in the face of the unfaithfulness of the broken world in which we live. Don't misunderstand the story of the cross. Jesus is not the innocent victim of an unpreventable crime. Jesus is the willing shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. What happened to Jesus is a travesty unlike maybe any that human history has ever seen. A completely innocent, sinless man being convicted by a whole bunch of parties involved here. We can't put the blame on one single group or person, right? There's a whole group that's involved in the forsaking, mistreating, trial, beating, and execution of Jesus. But don't for one second think that Jesus is simply a passive, innocent victim that died against his own will and plan. Jesus is a willing shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. You see, Jesus takes the place of Barabbas. He takes the place of the very ones who nail him to the cross. The innocent dies so that the guilty goes free. The innocent dies so that every Judas, every Pilate, every face in the crowd, every soldier in the cohort, every Pharisee in the sect, every Barabbas in the jail cell can go free. So that you and I, so that we can go free. He became our substitute. The great reformer Martin Luther called it the great exchange. That he exchanged his innocence for our guilt, so that our guilt might be exchanged for his innocence. In his book entitled Written in Blood, Robert Coleman tells a story of a little boy whose sister needed a blood transfusion. The doctor explained that she had the same disease the boy had recovered from 2 years earlier. Her only chance for recovery was a transfusion from someone who had previously conquered the disease. Since the two children had the same rare blood type, the boy was the ideal donor. Would you give your blood to your sister Mary so that she might live? The doctor asked. Little Johnny hesitated. His lower lip started to tremble. But then he smiled and said, "Sure, I'll do anything for my sister." Soon the two children were wheeled into the hospital room. Mary, pale and thin, Johnny, robust and healthy. Neither spoke, but when their eyes met, Johnny smiled. And as the nurse inserted the needle into his arm, Johnny's smile faded. He watched his blood flow through the tube. And with the ordeal almost over, his voice slightly shaking, he broke the silence when he looked at the doctor and said, "Doctor, when do I die?" See what was going on? Only in that moment did the doctor realize why Johnny had hesitated, why his little lip had trembled. He thought he was giving his blood to his sister meant that he would be giving up his own life for her. Fortunately, Johnny didn't have to die to save his sister. But each one of us has a condition far more serious than little Mary's, because we are all sinners. And it is required for Jesus to give not just his blood, but his very life, so that we might live. Now, the good news of that story is that Jesus does not remain dead. He takes his life back up again, which is what we'll celebrate in 2 weeks on Easter Sunday. But for today, we pause and we remember in the midst of this gruesome and horrible incident that we call the crucifixion. We remember that a completely innocent man was convicted to die by a group of sinners that includes us. But in his death, the guilty are declared innocent. That he became my substitute in every other Barabbas and Pilate, denying disciple, and Judas that sits in the seats of City Church alongside me this morning.